Mike was one of my trustees for quite some time, so I'm used to it. What time is quitting time, by the way? I need to know before we start. Right at 10? 10 straight up? Okay, good. And Hank has got some feedback on that. All right, that sounds better. Okay, good. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for being here. My normal work is at the Center for Religion and Public Life at Phillips Theological Seminary, where I'm talking a lot about the intersection between religion and culture and religion and politics, and I've had no want of materials on such matters over the last few years, and of course for longer than that, but a few years I've been able to pay attention to it. But for today, I'm doing something quite different. The pandemic has affected all of us in very profound ways. And I want to talk some about that. And as I thought about which of the biblical books or lessons might help us, I thought about this really odd little book that, in fact, I had significant time in seminary with, called To the Hebrews. It's not Paul's letter to the Hebrews. Nobody thinks Paul anymore that Paul wrote it. It is different from every other book in the New Testament, or frankly in the entirety of the Bible. There's a theology there that is different from every other book. Some scholars think it was written very late as far as the biblical canon goes, maybe even the turn of the first into the second century. And others say, no, it only makes sense if it was written before the temple was destroyed by the Romans in CE 70. So they've got 40, 50 years difference in when they think it was written. As far as who wrote it, no clue. As far as what community it was written to, all we have is the fact that this is some kind of sermon. And sometimes you can discern what a congregation is troubled by what the preacher is saying. By kind of backing up and saying, now what question or what problem is the preacher addressing? And there's some really interesting questions this preacher is addressing to a community that definitely is in stress. And they're definitely in stress because they had a time frame in mind as to when the fulfillment for their community's life would come about. And they definitely feel as if somebody has moved the goalposts, or for anybody who's ever run a race, and I was a cross-country runner in high school and early college till the knees gave, so most of my races were at the 3-mile level. If somebody said it to me as I'm kicking it in at the end of 3 miles, oops, this is a 6-miler. And you have no energy left. It's so defeating, right, to think that goalposts has changed. I think nearly everybody in our culture has had that experience sometime in the last 20 months or whatever it's been now. The goalposts feeling like they've gotten moved. When is this thing going to be over? Right? When can we go back to whatever normal is, or whatever the new normal is going to be? And we don't want to think this is the new normal. Right? So, we're going to get into the book in a little bit. I want to set it up a little bit more before we do so it gives you kind of an understanding of where the meat or the meaning for us might be in this book. And before I get into it, a couple of things. One is, so here's my understanding of how we interpret the Bible. Long time ago, I heard a Bible scholar say the Bible does not present models for morality. It presents mirrors for identity. That, for instance, in Jesus' parables, Jesus is telling us this parable so that we can deal with the people that we live with. Not necessarily to say, go down and do likewise. You know, it's a number of times in the parable you have an unjust judge who only because a woman is banging on his door repeatedly in the middle of the night gives her any justice. That is not that's God, go thou and do likewise. The prodigal son or the unrepentant elder brother, or however you want to do that parable, is it the elder brother's behavior we're supposed to mirror? No. Is it the younger brother's behavior? No. Is it the father? Well, maybe. The scholars debate on this one. But Doug Adams, the New Testament scholar, said this is helping us deal with people we need to deal with. When Abraham passed off Sarah as his sister rather than his wife, so that Pharaoh didn't destroy them, so that the people who were with didn't destroy him, are we supposed to do that? Are we supposed to lie and deceive? When Esau gives up his birthright for a bowl of food because he's hungry. Is that good? When Jacob gets his father to bless him by fooling his father into thinking that's his brother, are we supposed to go down and do likewise? When King David sets up Uriah at the front to be the first in the first row of people to be killed in battle, to cover over the affair in getting Bathsheba, Uriah's wife, pregnant. And then David goes into deep prayer while the child of their union gets sick, and when the child dies, just walks away just like nothing ever happened, and says, I'm going to pray as well as, I'll pray as long as there's a possibility the kid would live. Now the kid is not living, there's no sense to do this anymore, and goes off and does a business. There are just so many examples of that in the Bible where these are stories about interesting people, where there's often a deeper plot line going on that they themselves don't understand, but there's a whole lot in there, not all, but a whole lot in there of, no, it's not go down and do likewise, it's what do we learn from this? What do we learn from this in order to live the lives that we have to live today? I also think that the Bible presents, and it's fundamentally a relationship between a people and God. The way the people understand their relationship between themselves and God. And what understanding the Bible helps us to do is compare our own lives with them. Again, not necessarily that we're supposed to go and imitate them. And not necessarily that we will believe everything about God that necessarily they believe. There is plenty in the Bible. If you want a judgmental, punishing God, you can find that in the Bible. If you're looking for a loving, caring God who's infused into every bit of the energy and plasma of this universe, you can find that too. If you want to find love at the center of the universe, you can see that in the Bible. If you want to find a three-decker universe where there's heaven above, there's earth below, and there's Hades or hell or that place of shades, underneath that, you can find that. If you want to believe that Adam and Eve were two people who were created by God in 4004 BC, which according to Bishop Ussher's timeline, those who say the Earth's only 6,000 years old, that evolution is no such thing. The dinosaurs were all, they were on the ark, or they missed the ark, so that's why they're gone. You can find all that. So I find it helpful to say, here's the world they saw themselves in relationship with their God. How does that compare with the way we think of it? Last thing I'll say on that is about how I interpret. When you think about it, it's not the Bible which is our continuous connection point with Jesus. It's the church. Scary as that is. No, it's the community of faith that produced the Bible and constantly is in dialogue with that Bible as we go through history. But it's the community which is the connecting link with Jesus, which puts on us, I think, the responsibility always for interpretation. I do not believe that the Bible says. You always interpret. There is no thus saith the Lord without there being how do you interpret what the words are there about thus saith the Lord. So we're going to do some interpretation in what we do with Hebrews today. Here's a framework that I find really helpful. Some of you may know the book, a couple of different, maybe 2 or 3 different books by author now deceased named William Bridges. Wrote a number of business books, but also personal books about transition. One book is The Way of Transition, another book is all about how transition and change works in a business cycle. And he says this, he says, here's the difference between change and transition. Change is, I take this and I move it over here. Change is, I move from Chicago to Tulsa. Change is, a spouse dies, a parent dies. That's change. Transition is everything that happens between your 2 ears. All the ways you deal with that change. He says the cycle looks something like this. He's talking first about strategic planning, but it works for other sorts of things too. That you enter into a strategic plan that says we're here, we need to get over to here. And he says most strategic plans fail because they don't deal with the anxiety that comes between. Because of not paying attention to transition. Because the folks who wrote the strategic plan, they all think this is the way we have to move. It's just obvious. But not everybody in the organization has learned the same things they have learned, and they may want to stay exactly where they're at. So in between we're here, we need to get to there, is this middle period that Bridges says, this is the danger zone. He calls it the neutral zone, where both great things can happen and really bad, scary things can happen that can derail the whole thing. Bridges, at the end of one of his books, says, now, I got this idea by reading the Exodus narrative. Because you have, in the Exodus narrative, you have the captivity in Egypt. You have, on the other end, the promise of the promised land. But what's that whole 40 years thing in the wilderness? And that wilderness is definitely a place of danger and opportunity where a whole lot of new learning is supposed to take place. The Bible writers say, the question often put to the Bible, I should say, is well, why did they have to wander for 40 years in the wilderness? Because if you look on a map, there's no way all that should have taken 40 years. Right? And the old joke is because Moses is a guy and he couldn't ask for directions. Right? But the better meaning is that number 40, as you've been taught, I'm sure, many times, that number 40 in the Bible means there's a period of testing going on. There's a period of testing where maybe some new learning needs to happen. And scholars and preachers have said for generations, well, the people had a slavery mentality. They need to have a mentality of freedom, and they needed that transitional period to learn how to act as a free people, trusting in God rather than the flesh pots of Egypt. And not continually thinking, we had it better in Egypt, which of course we hear that problem raised numerous times, right? For Moses, would not want to have been, talk about transitional leadership, would not want to have been in Moses' shoes, right? These people constantly complaining. You could say there were supply chain issues that he had to deal with absolutely consistently on food and water, and where that was going to come from, and they had to trust that God was going to provide it, which was the theology getting worked out here. We know there were rebellions during the wilderness time. Both the people who said we're going to go a different direction, and those who said we should go back to Egypt. Now, think about being in the wilderness. You're unprepared to be there. You've run out of food that you can rely on. You don't know where the water is coming from. What happens when individuals start peeling off? First, what happens to that individual? Are they likely to make it out of the wilderness alive? Not unless they're Bear, Greer, whatever the guy's name is, who does the TV shows and being able to, unless you're survivalist, which I don't assume they were. So if you peel off, it's some pretty high percentage you may die. And if enough people peel off, the community itself that's trying to move through it gets so diminished that at some point the community may be unsustainable. And they may not make it through as a community. It's all transition. All this business, the change for them was we were slaves in Egypt and we're going on to the promised land. And the in-between time is this time of tremendous transition where there's suffering, there's pain, there's death, there's also the giving of the commandments, there's a new relationship with God established, and along the way they're supposed to be learning somehow to trust. There's a lot going on in that middle period. Let's see. Yeah, and one of the fundamental questions that I'm sure was behind Moses' continual, when he's trying to instruct the people and not complaining to God about the instruction they need, the question in Moses' mind that is because the people are raising this. Are we all in this together? You remember how at the start of the pandemic there was this celebrities and others were doing the kind of almost PSA type things. We're all in this together. Well, as a nation, how do you think that's worked out? It's kind of iffy, isn't it? And it depends on who the us is. Who's the us that's all in this together? A lot of countries in the world, they look at the parts of our country that have refused vaccines or where vaccines have gotten spoiled because people didn't make their appointments and the vaccines were bought and all that kind of thing. There's so many places in the world that haven't had vaccines, they look at us and just, with anger, shaking their heads. When I think, I don't know where it's at today, but I continually pay attention to news from Guatemala because we adopted a little girl from there 14 some years ago now. She's 15. Guatemala's vaccination rate as of about a month ago was 5%. Now, and they've gotten most of their vaccines either from, I think, Russia or China. If I were to put two places in the world I would not want to trust the efficacy, I think they'd be towards the top of my list right now. So, are we all in this together? Not as a world, we're not. Not as a nation, we're not. One could say, depending on the state, yes or no, more or less. And then there's the, how does this affect congregations? How has this affected our individual lives? So, I want to set up that the book of Hebrews is basically addressed to a community of people who are experiencing themselves in a wilderness type setting, where they have left something. They are hoping for something on the other side, but they're in that middle range right now, and the goalposts, the finish line, have been moved to a point where they don't know where the end is going to be. And yet they've got this preacher in front of them that's trying to hold them together as a community. He's using everything he's got at his disposal to do so. He's trying to encourage, and he's also putting the fear of God into them, quite literally. Because there are lines in here about our God as a consuming fire. He's constantly reminding the people of, you know what happened to the people who rebelled in the wilderness? They died. Right? And he also says things like, you know, if you people were mature, instead of acting like children by now, I wouldn't have to repeat these things. I mean, so he's doing things that modern preachers mostly wouldn't do. Because congregations would be, I don't need to be shamed in church. But he's got some of that going in here. Maybe one of those, look at it as do you see yourself in that or not, rather than preachers go down and do likewise with your congregations. Before we get into, I want to get into some of the text here. Before I do that, I do want to ask just for a few minutes. I'll watch our time to make sure that we can get to the actual biblical text a little bit. And I mean these are serious questions, and so if few of you would volunteer answers, that would be great. How has the pandemic affected your life and the life of your family? All right, such as in my family, my dad died, not of COVID, but he was 93, he had a couple of strokes, lungs were filling up because he had lung cancer, and he died about a week and a half before the nation shut down. It was March 8th or thereabouts of 2020. I had spent a week with him a couple of weeks before. We couldn't do a memorial service then. My family wound up having to go forward with it, even though I couldn't be present in middle of July, or late June it was, because my mom was grieving, was stuck in one place so much that the rest of the family thought she needs to have this service in order for the possibility of moving on. Even starting to move on, which she's still pretty much, it's been a tough time to grieve, right? Because you can't even have the rituals of grieving. You know, your Jewish families would then sit in Shiva via Zoom and the like. It's disrupted those kinds of things. It was our daughter's, Eliana's would have been her 8th grade year of school, and her school didn't have the virtual option we thought they were going to have because of my age and because of Sherry's had pneumonia numerous times, and when she gets sick, she gets really sick up here in the same way that COVID hits you so bad. So we were real cautious with her, wound up having to pull her out of the school she'd been in for 12 years and finish it kind of at a homeschool kind of thing. Those were the kind of disruptions in my family. And of course, there was the standard weight gain, ate too much candy, made too many chocolate chip cookies early on, now in fact I have some therapy going around my legs to kind of get my knees back working again from too much sitting, but that goes along with being a mere 66. So those were just a few little things that's happening in my family. How has this affected your family?
We had a baby born in our family, great-grandfather. It was a completely different experience because we couldn't be at the hospital, we couldn't see him until they came home. Mom had complications, Nana was a nervous wreck. And it was very stressful because it wasn't a normal event and took away some of the joy as well because you couldn't have friends over, have a sit and see, you couldn't share the joy. So it was a very different
Yes.
We moved to Tulsa 2 years ago, yesterday, and we had barely started getting acquainted, and then we shut down, and it seemed like then we're free, and it's all over, but it's all it isn't, and then about 5 weeks ago, they were saying, oh, the vaccine, so they did the vaccine, and we're sitting there tested positive, and I'm like, I don't think it's what we need something else, and then they come up with the booster. So it's affected us a lot in this transition.
Absolutely. Thank you. Somebody else?
I think it's
Yes.
affected all of us, with healthcare. All of us have experienced, all of a sudden a Zoom appointment with your doctor or a family that needs care, and you don't want to go to the ER, and that's been a huge change.
Right. Dental care. Yes, you said.
Well, I think the good that has come out of it, or that came out of it, was families were forced to be together and spend time together with young kids, watch movies, work puzzles, cook together. I think that was a good thing that came out of it. I know it was for us, and I'm sure there isn't anyone who hasn't been affected.
Of course. Yes, I think that's true. I don't think there's anybody who hasn't been affected. Some more profoundly than others, and some more permanently than others. I know one of our seminary graduates, who's a social worker now, has organized support groups for people who have dealt with long-term consequences of COVID. Either a loved one died, or they got long COVID and they've got some kind of permanent health symptoms. And before he did a training with nurses and doctors regarding kind of the mental health issues facing families who are still dealing with COVID in some way, some significant way because of grief and loss in their family. And he asked the families, what do you want the medical personnel to know? And the number one thing he said is, everybody wants to move on. We can't move on. We don't feel like we can really move on. But normal for us isn't something we can face yet on what the other side looks like. So really profound stuff. How about for the congregation? How has this pandemic time affected the congregation other than improvements in technology? Which I go to Boston Avenue, and they took the opportunity as soon as they had supply to upgrade all their classroom technology and the like, so that even as they've come back in person, they've been trying to do a Zoom option along with the in-person option. And I think a lot of churches who have done that are looking at, is this a permanent change? Is this not just a transitional moment, but is this actually a additional way of reaching people that is now part permanently of the landscape? How has this affected the congregation? Yeah.
I think there are people who have decided to stay at home and watch church online because now it's available. And they can have their coffee and sit in their jammies and enjoy being at home, but still hearing the sermon or the music.
Yeah, thank you. Others? Yes.
Well, I think the fact that we've had to wear masks, we realize how much facial expressions help us kind of, how often we read lips instead of actually hearing. But I think that has made maybe a little bigger impact than it seems like it would if you just told someone that.
I think that's right. Thank you. Yes.
I think the energy is deflated without the numbers. It's like a magnet or like, atoms, whatever. When the more people there are, the more connection there is, and the more energy it brings.
Yeah, I can certainly feel and see that. One more?
happening then. And it couldn't be at the sanctuary in front of his new members, his new church members.
Mhm.
And that's been difficult on David, it's been difficult on all of us in certain ways, because we didn't all come together.
Mhm.
Tough time for transition.
It is. I know Lee Dominic, who's the rector at Trinity Episcopal Church, he came about the time you all arrived. They were saying it was like November of 2019, and then everything shuts down in March, so he barely got to know anybody. And yeah, that's tough. It's tough. One of the things that higher education have been saying about using technology for connecting is that as long as a community has face-to-face connections first, face-to-face in-person connections first, the technology can help sustain those connections. It's not impossible to build connections via Zoom and Microsoft Teams and the like, but it's easier to sustain connections already have. And so one of the questions I know is, and how often do you need to actually see each other, be in each other's presence, be embodied presences and not just heads with dogs barking and occasionally phones ringing in the background, which has happened so often on Zoom calls. So I know when I'm listening to a service at home, I'm sometimes doing something else. And I'm not paying attention the same way. Not to say that everybody, just because they're sitting in church, are paying attention. I do know people who told me over the years, grocery list is getting done in church. So, let's get to the sermon. And that Hebrews is addressing with one more addition. The preacher thinks, that if God cares about you, God disciplines you, and you will learn something from suffering. This preacher says this. Again, this is one of those points of interpretation. We agree with that, disagree with that, we agree with that sometimes, not at all. But he's trying to say that this suffering has a reason to it. And that in fact, suffering is a sign that God really loves you. Which reminds me of a line from Teresa of Avila, 16th century mystic and saint of the church, who had numerous conversations with God. And she set up, she was both a mystic and an administrator. She set up orders of women religious all over the place, traveled, she was an itinerant, traveled all kinds of miles by foot, by horseback, and then in her older age by carriage. And as she was quite old, her carriage had to go across a very cold, deep stream, and had to get out of the carriage to wade through it. She says to God, says, "Why do I have to do this still? I'm cold." And God says back to her, "Well, this is the way I treat my friends." And she says back to God, "That is why you have so few of them." Which may be some of the response the preacher's getting here. So let's go. We got about 20 minutes left. Let's see what he has to say. I put a Reader's Digest version of the book of Hebrews up here for those who still remember what Reader's Digest was. Long ago, God spoke to our ancestors in many and various ways by the prophets. Now, it starts long ago, so way out in the past. But in these days, today, He's spoken to us by a Son, whom He appointed heir of all things, through whom He also created the worlds. For the multi-universe people, created the worlds. Interesting. He is the reflection of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's very being, and sustains all things by his powerful word. It sounds something like the start of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and with God, and all. When he made purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. Now he's going to come back to the purification for sins thing numerous times. Having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. The conspiracy theory, the false news, the what are you thinking kind of thing this preacher's dealing with is the people apparently thought angels were worthy of worship. And so he's starting out by saying, it's not angels we're worshiping here, people, it's Jesus. Of the angels, he says, he makes his angels winds and his servants flames of fire, but of the Son, he says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever, and the righteous scepter is the scepter of your kingdom. And are not all angels spirits of the divine service sent to serve for the sake of those who inherit salvation? So, again, he's trying to say, in the order of being, yeah, there are angels, he says, but angels are not where you're putting them, people. There's something worthy of worship, and angels are not them. It was fitting that God, for whom and through whom all things exist, in bringing many children to glory, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through sufferings. The pioneer of their salvation is Jesus. And he starts out, now either this is of interest or of concern for people who don't like to suffer, and who does. The pioneer of their salvation was made perfect. Perfect meaning complete, fulfilled, is what that Greek word means. Perfect through sufferings. That somehow suffering brings you on to something greater than you were. That's not necessarily a good harbinger for what's to come as far as where this preacher is with these people. It's clear he did not come to help angels, but the descendants of Abraham. Therefore he had become like his brothers and sisters in every respect, so that he might be merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God, to make a sacrifice of atonement for the sins of the people. Now remember, the Jewish sacrificial system, how sins are forgiven. Once a year, a high priest goes into the temple, first in the outer part, offering blood from a bull for the sins of the people. Actually, there was, a lamb for the sins of the people, and then a bull for himself. Because the bull, if in the Bible and in the Hebrew Bible, there is no forgiveness of sin without the shedding of blood. I mean, you have to understand that mentality. There's no forgiveness of sin without the shedding of blood. The more powerful the animal, the more powerful the blood for forgiveness. So while the whole people get a sheep or a goat, I don't remember which it is, I think it's a goat, for the high priest has to sacrifice a bull. Why? Because they want to make sure that high priest sins are squeaky clean before the high priest that once a year goes through into the Holy of Holies in the inner part of the temple and offers the sacrifice for the people. He needs to be clean. He needs to be absolutely clean. And how often is this ritual done? Once a year. Once a year, the Day of Atonement. It's done in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible. Okay, so that's what's in the background here. Therefore, he's come to become like his brothers and sisters in every respect, so that he might be merciful and high priest in the service of God and make sacrifice for atonement for the sins of the people. Because he himself has been tested by what he suffered, he's able to help those who are tested. Remember we said the people are being tempted to get out of their community. This is taking too long. We don't know where this is going. And the preacher's saying, yeah, and Jesus also was tempted to leave his vocation. He was tempted, he suffered, he stayed with it. And therefore, so should we. Therefore, brothers and sisters, holy partners in heavenly calling, consider that Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession, was faithful to the one who appointed him, just as Moses also was faithful in God's house. Therefore, as the Holy Spirit says, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, as in the rebellion, calling to mind what? The wilderness rebellions. Again, because these people are feeling like we're in the wilderness, as on the day of testing in the wilderness, where your ancestors put me to the test, though they had seen my works. Take care, brothers and sisters, that none of you may have an evil, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. But exhort one another every day, as long as it's called today, so that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. For we have become partners in Christ, if only we hold our first confidence firm to the end. Since then we have a great high priest that's passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast to our confession. There are three-decker universe, and here's one of the things that's coming in this. That's again quite different from anything we would imagine, which is in heaven there is the actual temple of God, and here in Jerusalem the temple is but a shadow. It's just a copy of the heavenly. What's here is imperfect. What's up there is perfect. And somehow in their mindset, they believe that perfect is going to eventually come down here to earth. That was part of this. If you were to do your kingdom come, that's what they had in mind, for this particular community had in mind, is that this temple would come here. Who serves in the temple in heaven? Jesus, right? And we're getting to that. Although Jesus was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And having been made perfect, complete, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, having been designated by God a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. You know, what? Now I'll say, in the Catholic Church, in the traditional ordination ceremony, they still talk about a priest being in the order of Melchizedek. Well, unless you're a complete Bible geek or raised Baptist and had to go to church 5 times a week, you probably don't know who Melchizedek was. Melchizedek is this strange little figure that Abraham runs into at one point in the Genesis narrative. And Abraham offers a gift to Melchizedek, a tithe. So that's the background. That's all the Old Testament says. That's all the Hebrew Bible says about Melchizedek. But this preacher, preachers can sometimes make a lot out of a little. And this preacher does that. He says, this king Melchizedek of Salem, Salem, by the way, as in Jerusalem, tradition came that Melchizedek was the king of Jerusalem. Priest of the Most High God, met Abraham as he was returning from defeating the kings and blessed him. And to him, Abraham apportioned 1/10 of everything. His name in the first case means king of righteousness. Melchi is king. Zedek is righteousness, so his name does mean king of righteousness. But he's also king of Salem, that is king of peace. King of Salem, as in Jerusalem. So he's saying this Melchizedek, king of righteousness, king of peace. Who's his son like to you? What do we sing about at Christmas time? King of righteousness, king of peace. Sounds like Jesus. See, in their world, God sometimes sent a type of one who is to come. There's the shadow and the real. Melchizedek was the forerunner, was the shadow of the real Jesus who's coming. Why is he doing this? Without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, who remains a priest forever. I mean, he makes the connection clear here. This Melchizedek is a Jesus figure. See how great it is. Even Abraham the patriarch gave him 1/10 of the spoils. It's beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior. It's even more obvious that another priest arises resembling Melchizedek, one who has become a priest, not through a legal arrangement concerning physical descent, but through the power of indestructible life. Who were the priests who served in the temple? What line did they come from? Levi. They were Levitical priests. Was Jesus from the house of Levi? No. No, he was from Judah, a house of David. So, how could Jesus be a priest if he's not from the house of Levi? He is one after the order of Melchizedek, that alternative, who in fact was superior to any priest that has ever served. Unlike the other high priests, he has no need to offer sacrifices day after day for his own sins and then for the people. This he did once for all when he offered himself. See, what this author is saying is, and I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit, Jesus on the cross, first on the cross and then in the temple in heaven, has become both. He was the perfect victim on the cross, and he was the perfect high priest using his own blood, not just to cover over sin for the year, but to wipe it away. And this, the author is saying, makes Jesus superior to the Levitical priesthood and makes the temple we're waiting for superior to the old temple. Now, if you believed that sins are covered over in this once-a-year basis, and you stopped practicing that as you're waiting for this new thing to be fulfilled, but year after year starts to go by, you're seeing what's happening in the temple, which you used to participate in all the time, and now you're not doing that anymore because you're waiting for Jesus' return, but Jesus is not coming back yet. That temple hasn't come down from heaven. The whole thing hasn't been fulfilled. What are you as a community going to do? Well, some might want to go back and figure out, how do I get back to normal? But what the author is saying to him is, what you thought was normal is in the past, and it's dead. You can't go back to that which is dead. It doesn't work anymore. You need to look forward. So then I'm just, for those of you who know this book at all, you know it's somehow about, I'm trying to get back, sorry. Here. Chapter 11. Chapter 11, which begins, now faith, which is what he's talking about through this whole thing, through the whole book. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. This is not optimism. Optimism might be based on, I can see things starting to align, the tumblers are starting to click, things are looking good. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Indeed, by faith our ancestors received approval. By faith we understand the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was made from things that are not visible. By faith Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain's, though this he received approval as righteous, God himself being given approval of the gifts. He died, but through his faith he still speaks. Sometimes the preacher stretches things a little bit here. By faith, Noah, warned by God about events not yet seen, yet unseen, respected the warning and built an ark to save his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir to the righteousness that's in accordance with faith. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out on a place he was to receive as an inheritance. And he set out not knowing where he was going. He looked forward to that city who has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. In other words, where they think they've now positioned themselves to at some point receive. Therefore, from one person, and him as good as dead, descendants were born as many as the stars. All these died in faith, without having received the promises, but from a distance they saw and greeted them. They confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on the earth. For people who speak in this way, make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. I'm going to stop there. What he's saying is that faith means walking a path even if you're not going to see the end of that journey, but that this is the right path to walk. Is that hard? Of course it is. Of course it is. We're so oriented, especially in our country, I think, we're quite oriented to success and progress. And we want to see things happen now. We have a very short time frame in which we expect things to happen. One of my learnings during the pandemic, I think is when I read this book, was during the pandemic. There's a book by a citizen Potawatomi Nation woman who's also a PhD botanist. Her name is Robin Wall Kimmerer, and her book is Braiding Sweetgrass. And it's an absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous book. And one of the things she talks about in there that I've read about in numerous places now is, the so-called Iroquois Confederacy, the native nations that were in upstate New York area and kind of that part of the country through the Great Lakes. They formed, an early kind of democracy. And in fact, Ben Franklin visited them and may have learned a thing or two about how you have kind of a confederation with both centralized government and a lot of decisions pushed to the local level. Anyways, in terms of their time frame, their time frame is when you make a major decision, imagine it 7 generations forward. 7 generations. A lot of us can't imagine the next quarter. And there are a whole lot of businesses that seem to be, what's the bottom line for the next quarter? Because the stakeholders, the shareholders want to see that return. 7 generations. What a completely different mindset from, I need to have this fixed tomorrow. I need to have this fixed today. How does one remain faithful when can't see the finish line? What does it mean to be faithful in this time? That's where I think the book of Hebrews, I think it's worth taking a look at with these kinds of questions in mind. We're in a transition. What's going to come out on the other side? We don't know exactly. How do we walk faithfully through this time is a question I think we should be asking. Thanks so much for your attention this morning.